So, Resurrection Sunday. We've been looking at the Easter message over the last 4 weeks, and we've been looking at John's Gospel. And I shared last week how John wrote his Gospel as a treasure hunt. And his treasure hunt was meant to lead people to the treasure who was Jesus and help them discover who Jesus was and uncover that Jesus is both the Son of God and he is the Son of Man. And so John constructed his stories. He collected just a handful of ministries, 7 miracles and 7 sayings of Jesus, and uses all sorts of symbols to build this treasure map that when you follow the clues, you come to the realization of, that's who Jesus is. He's the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Son of God, Son of Man. Today, I want to take you on a part of John's treasure hunt that's included in John chapter 20, if you've got your Bibles or your phone Bibles with you, I want to show you how John plays a version of Find Waldo. How many of you loved Find Waldo when you were growing up? Yeah, you remember the childhood book where it's all sorts of pictures like this, and you've got a guy hidden amongst the picture who's dressed as Waldo. Well, it is Waldo. He's got glasses, he's dressed in white and black, and he's got a hat, and you have to find him in the story, yeah? And I would spend hours as a kid looking for Waldo and trying to find him, and it was always fun when you found him. Well, John plays a biblical version of Find Waldo in his gospel, and his version of Find Waldo isn't Find Waldo or even Find Jesus, although Jesus is very clearly illustrated in the book. But one of the things he does in his gospel is he plays the game, find the creation story. Find the creation story in his book. It's hidden in his story, and those with some understanding of the creation story would have read John's gospel and went, there's the creation story in there. There's the creation story in there. And let me give you an illustration of this before we get into John chapter 20. So at the beginning of his gospel, he starts with these words. He says this, John chapter 1, verse 1, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Now, for anyone with a little bit of biblical understanding, they recognize a familiarity with the sound of that passage. It sounds a whole lot like the Genesis story, doesn't it? Yeah, look, let's see the slide that shows that. Having just read these words. So Genesis 1 begins with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It sounds just like John, doesn't it? The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. We found Waldo. We found Waldo in the story at the beginning of John. And so John plays this game of find Waldo, or not Waldo, but creation in his story. And I'm going to read quite a lot of John chapter 20, which is the resurrection account. And I want you to find Waldo as I am reading it, okay? So listen up and see how many instances of the creation story you think appear in the story. And I'm going to test you afterwards. So John chapter 20. Now, the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. And she ran and came to Simon Peter, to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him." Therefore Peter went out, and the other disciple, and they were going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down, looking in, saw the linen cloths lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that he had been around his head, not laying there with linen cloths, but folded together in place by itself. Then the other disciple whom came to the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not know the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again to their own homes. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "Because they've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." Now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and she said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I've not ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she'd seen the Lord, that he'd spoken these things to her. Then the same day at evening, beginning the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled, for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." He then said this. He showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad that they had seen the Lord. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace to you. As the Father has sent me, I send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they're retained." So I know there's a lot in there, but how much of the creation story did you see? I want us to go through it together. I want to show you 7 instances. There's more in there. And I'm finding them with each read. I'm finding additional things. But I want to run through 7 pieces of the creation story. And more than that, I want to show you why John actually does this. And actually, let me explain that as a heads up to you. Why would John use the creation story and weave this into the story of Jesus? How many of you know what a meta-narrative is? Not many. Okay, some of you do. How many of you know what a narrative is? Yeah, a story. A meta means big. Yep. So a meta-narrative means big story or the big picture. And so a meta-narrative is often the overarching big picture idea that is contained in a story that all the other kind of sub-stories are connected in with it. And in the Bible, the meta-narrative of the Bible is actually contained within the creation story. There's 4 elements in the creation story that flow through the rest of the Bible. And all of the Bible is touched by these 4 themes. You've got, at the beginning, the creation of the heavens and the earth in Genesis chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. And then something happens in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. There's the fall, where Adam and Eve disobey God, and the impact and the consequence of that has historical consequences, universal historical consequences on humanity. And ever since, humanity has been experiencing the fall. And then the third element within the story, the meta-narrative story in creation, is redemption. So after God explains the consequences of their sin to Adam and Eve, he kills the very first animal. And we're told that God covers Adam and Eve's nakedness with an animal skin. And some people think that the blood was still dripping off the skin when God gave that. And of course, that is a picture of what God is going to do through the person of Jesus Christ, through the blood of the Lamb. So there is creation, there is fall, there is redemption, but there is also the promise of recreation. In the story of Genesis, God gives Adam and Eve a promise that a future descendant of them will crush the head of the serpent that had been so instrumental in the fall account. There's a promise of a redemption, recreation in this. And those four themes, this big picture meta-narrative, John uses and he weaves into his story, and he identifies both Jesus as part of this story, but the main character of this meta-narrative. He's the one that is going to bring redemption from the fall and bring new creation. All right. So let me run through the 7 things quickly, because everyone's hungry for lunch. The 7 things that appear in this story. How many of you caught at the very beginning of John's story the idea of creation? How many of you saw that? So at the beginning of the story, it says, on the first day. What does that remind you of? The creation story. It's a 7-day account. And the first day is where God begins it all. It's the day where he causes light to come out of darkness. And so John grabs that idea and he weaves this into his account of what's happening in the resurrection scene. And the idea is that God, the creator of all things, is doing a new thing in the midst of the darkest of circumstances ever. And then secondly, how many of you saw the reference to the fall in the, not the reference to the fall, let me do the second, the reference to darkness was the second thing in the story. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb while it's still dark. And I read the verse already out of Genesis where it says, the earth was without form and darkness was over the face of the deep. And so John is using an echo from the creation story here in the resurrection story. That here at the very beginning of the creation story, where it's still dark, God starts to do amazing transformation. And the idea is that John is inviting you and I into the story, that we get caught up into this and we think about areas of darkness and death that are in our lives. And we're invited to imagine with John that this isn't just a story far, far away, but Jesus is actually doing a work in our lives where the graves are going to be transformed. So let's carry on. The third thing, I don't know if you caught, I caught in this story, was the idea of chaos. And it's hidden in the actual translation, or many translations, of the Genesis account. But the verse from Genesis that I read earlier is more literally translated, the earth was chaos and waste, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And so chaotic water is the first image in the Bible, and it's meant to represent a state of uncreation or pre-creation. And again, we know the story. We've read the book of creation, that God does something with the uncreated. He does something to the chaos that is over the primordial waters. And it's an invitation for John is issuing an invitation for you and I to actually imagine where there is chaos in our lives. And he's giving you a hope. He's giving you a glimmer of the sun rising over this. That God is going to do something amazing with those things in our lives. And the idea of chaos is everywhere in this story. There's more references to running in this story than any other place combined in the Gospels. And John captures the idea of running, not as someone getting fit and buff, but someone freaking out. Mary, she goes to the tomb, finds it's empty, and she sprints back to the disciples' house. And the idea, I don't know if you captured this in your mind, but when I'm a very visual person, I could see Mary in her head going, ah! Ah! She doesn't know what's going on, and she's just full of energy and panic and chaotic. And she shares about what she's discovered about the empty tomb. And Peter and John capture her panic, and they start running. Ah! The idea of chaos is in this story. No one knows what's going on. And for us in our lives where there is this uncreation, or there's this brokenness, or there is this pain, or there is this death, when we're in the midst of those circumstances in our lives, it can feel very chaotic, can't it? It can feel like nothing is in order and it's all undone, and we can feel upside down and topsy-turvy. And John captures this emotion in the story, and he wants you to find yourself in this story as he's telling this. But he doesn't leave it there. And actually what I'd add is that sometimes our chaos are dreams that we have believed for that are dashed. Mary's chaos was that she'd placed her hope in Jesus being the King of Kings and Messiah, and her messianic expectations didn't play out as she thought that they were going to do. And sometimes in our lives, we pin our hopes on, God's going to have to do something this way in my life, otherwise my life's upside down. And it doesn't happen that way. And the things that we prayed for don't come to pass. And it feels like death to us in that area of our life. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And John is connecting his readers, you and I, with this sense of chaos and emptiness and void that is there in this story and in the creation story. But then he doesn't leave it there, does he? Because we know something is happening in the story. This is a story of Jesus, after all. And Jesus was always, in John's story, the surpriser of humanity, the person who would always do the unexpected in people's lives and in circumstances. And so we know that there is a surprise coming. And John invites us to put on the shoes of Mary and recognize that there are times in our lives that we may not know what God is up to and what he's doing, but we need to realize out of the darkness, he's going to bring transformation. He's going to bring resurrection. So the next thing from the Genesis story is the aspects of the garden and the gardener. How many of you saw that in the story? I think that the gardener piece is often the most obvious overtone from the Genesis account. If you remember in John's story, when she's looking for Jesus, goes to the tomb, finds it empty, she's told by the angels, he's not here. And then she turns round and she says to a man she doesn't recognize as Jesus, do you know where they've placed him? And then John says these words, thinking he was the gardener. Who's the gardener in the Genesis story? Not God. Who was the gardener in the Genesis creation story? Adam and Eve. Their job was to tend the paradise garden. And we know the story of the fall. What happens is they're evicted from the gardener. They get their redundancy papers and they're booted out. And here in the story, Jesus is identified as being a gardener. What could God be saying through this? He's saying that it's game on again for humanity. That Jesus wasn't just God, he was man. And what was lost, the job that was lost in the garden, is recaptured in a garden. John's account describes the cross happening in a garden and Jesus' tomb being in a garden. You've got the creation account happening in the midst of the resurrection story. And by this time, John's readers are getting the idea, oh my goodness, recreation is happening. Recreation, it's not creation, it's recreation, because this isn't day one. This, folks, is day 8. It's a new creation, and God was doing something amazing through Jesus. What happened in the Genesis creation story with the first gardeners? What did they do to get evicted? Do you remember? What was it that they did? Yeah, they took some forbidden fruit and they ate it. God gave one command. He said, enjoy this garden, this wonderful garden that I've given you. But there's one tree there that I don't want you to eat the fruit of. It's forbidden. And Adam and Eve, they eat from the tree and they take into themselves the forbidden fruit. You know the story. But it wasn't just Adam and Eve. There's one particular person in this story who was predominantly the instigator of the fall. Do you remember who that was? Well, yeah, the serpent, but he was the tempter. But who did he tempt? Eve, the woman. The woman. The woman. And you remember what Adam says to God after God says, hey, how do you know you're naked? And he said, the woman, she's to blame. She gave me the fruit and I ate it. And he passes the blame. And in many ways, ever since, humanity has been targeting women in particular. They have. One of the things that gets out of order because of the fall, and that's really what happens, is the world gets out of harmony with one another. People are unable to relate to God right. They're unable to relate to themselves right. They're unable to relate to one another rightly. And one of the things that gets out of sync with one another is man's relationship with women. And we looked at this a few weeks ago, where the Bible's very clear in its description of man and woman being co-equal, same status, same level, not one subordinate to one another. And women, since the fall, have borne a stigma on them in which they were targeted and that they were pinpointed and they were made, in many instances, second-class citizens. All the women are like, and Jesus, in this account, is mainly dealing with Mary Magdalene. And she represents Eve in the creation story, the one that was deceived by the serpent. How do we know this? If you know anything about the story of Mary Magdalene in the Gospels, we know that from the other Gospels that she was the one that was possessed by not one evil spirit, seven evil spirits possessed her. So if you've ever experienced anyone that has suffered from demonic affliction, You know that they're psychologically pretty broken. And if you've ever actually prayed for someone and you've seen them delivered from evil spirits, it's spectacular in terms of the night and day impact on their life as the demonic affliction lifts off them. And normally we're just dealing, when we're praying for someone, where that shows up, with one entity. She had 7 of these beasties in her life. And these beasties are often represented in the demonic as snake-like creatures. So Mary Magdalene in this story is pretty much the chief player in this story. And this speaks of something phenomenal in this story. It's speaking of something new that is happening for humanity, but in particular for women. There is a lifting of the stigma that has hung over women. The cloud that has hung over women because of the curse is removed by Jesus. The very fact that she's the first to the tomb. She's the first to see the risen Lord and interact with him. She is the first to touch the risen Lord. And then she's the first that is told by Jesus to go and tell about him. And by the way, he sends her. Do you know what that means? Who are the sent ones in the Bible? Who are the sent ones? What does sent one mean? Apostle. He apostolizes her. Who's the first apostle? Mary, after the fall. Holy moly. This is redemption and new creation happening in the story. And it speaks for women, yes, but it speaks for anyone that bears a stigma in this world. The stigma of ethnicity or race, the color of your skin or your nationality. It speaks of the stigma of disability or mental illness. The stigma of social class. The stigma of intelligence or wiring. Because there's people here that struggled in school and got bullied, not just by your peers, but by the teachers, because your wiring was more for the creative things, not the academic things like the sciences or maths, because God created you this. And you've lived with a stigma ever since. Jesus comes into the chaos of our lives and he removes the stigma from us in his encounter with Mary. And then number 6, the idea of peace and shalom, which is there in the garden. The rabbis say this, Rabbi Shmuley Botich, I love that name. He's a TV rabbi, apparently in the States, been on all sorts of talk shows. He talks a lot of common sense. He says this about peace. He says, the ancient rabbis say that when God created the world in 6 days, it lacked the most important ingredient of all, peace. When God rested on the 7th day from the whirlwind of activity, the world he created was finally perfect. And then he goes on to say, a non-Jewish friend once asked me, how do you say hello in Hebrew? Shalom, I told him. And how do you say goodbye? Shalom, I responded again. He was confused. How many things does shalom mean? I thought it meant peace, not that it was a greeting or salutation. And then Shmuley Botich said back to him, in Hebrew, peace is at the center of all worlds and all ideas. It surrounds our coming and our going. It must accompany us wherever we go and in whatever we do. On the 7th day, when God rested and had the first Sabbath, there was peace. There was peace in the world. But because of the fall, that was lost. In John's resurrection story, Jesus comes to the disciple, again, when you read the text, on the first day of the week, on day 8 of creation. And what does he do? He speaks to them. Shalom, shalom. That which that they had been missing from their life, the missing ingredient from a world out of harmony with its creator and with one another. He restores to them because of the forgiveness of sin. Shalom, shalom, shalom. Can you imagine? They weren't just words. Can you imagine the rippling effect in each of them as Jesus spoke that, and the substance of his words connected with every aspect of their life? Can you imagine some of them going, whoa, 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 what was that? Whoa, do you feel that? Oh, I feel so peaceful. My chaotic thinking in my head, Peter would have said, has gone. I no longer feel ADHD anymore. I know, and John, and the anxiety he had about his sense of identity, about am I worthy, am I loved? Shalom. It shattered it at its root. Poof. And he knows that he knows that he knows that he knows that he is lovable, chosen, accepted, and delighted in by God. Shalom, 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 shalom. And those words have never stopped rippling from the cross to this day. And you may be sitting here with anxiety or all sorts of disorder or all sorts of, what's the psychological book now? It's version 5. What's that, Jody? The DSM book? Yeah, DSM disorder out of version 5 of all sorts of anxiety, that there is no medical cure for it. Well, Jesus comes along and he says, shalom, 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 shalom. And his words are spirit, folks, and life. Spirit and life. And he comes along, and that snake that has pursued you all your life, he comes along to, and he goes, shalom. And then lastly, number 7, he commissions them to do what he has done for them. John says, as the Father has sent me, I also sent you. And when he said this, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. Where in the Genesis story does the breath of God show up in the story? Over Adam. God breathes on Adam and he becomes a fully functional, fully whole individual. That which was damaged and lost in the fall is reinstated in the recreation of resurrection. Soul healing here, people. Soul healing. Soul healing. Soul healing. And he tells his disciples, freely you've received, freely you give. That which you've got and apprehended of this resurrection life, folks, you go and give to other people. The power of the cancelled sin that comes through forgiveness, where that's touched your life in any way, and you've got a mark of resurrection life, freely you've received that. You go tell someone else that you meet in your family or your workplace about what's available to them. I shared this story about, what's the guy's name? But the phrase about evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And where you've found bread and eaten your full becomes life-giving bread to the people around you. Powerful stuff. There's so much more of God that you and I have not tasted and touched and apprehended. And we tend to put too much into eternity. Can't wait to get to heaven because such and such won't be hounding me there. The gospel message of Christ and what surprised his disciples so much was that eternity had broken into them in their everyday lives. That's why it was gospel. The word gospel means good news. Heaven is good news as part, but if you've got a problem where the red lights are flashing in your life now, knowing that you're going to be good in far, far away land at the end of your life doesn't bring you much hope when the lights are flashing. Gospel was that through the person of Jesus comes in now. And I think you and I have believed way too little for the gospel. And it's not to put condemnation on us, it's to actually encourage us to begin to pray, God, how do we apprehend more of this? Give me a greater revelation of what's available now, because if my bank account's full, I want to know how to access what Jesus has deposited in there. I want that. I want that life. Teach me. Do whatever it is required so that that is real. That's kind of my prayer life. All right. I want to pray over you, and I'm going to get you to stand. Nothing special about standing. Just probably activate your brains a bit more because you've been sitting for a long time listening to me. We believe in this church that, let me rephrase that. Our prayer, our leadership team's prayer, my prayer for the messages that I bring each week is that somehow that they would capture the heart of God for people in a way that God comes into reach, that you're able to apprehend what God has for us, and that God begins to touch your lives in a way that the blessing of what Jesus paid for in the cross becomes your reality. There are pieces of the story that I shared today that connect with your life. And my invitation for you, and I'm going to pray over you in a minute, is that you begin to pray now, and I'll give you a moment in a second to do this, that you would pray like prayers to God. God, I see it. It's there in the story. I've heard it for me. Help me to lay hold of what Jesus has started in this story of recreation through the resurrection. So why don't you pray that now, kind of put into your own words what I was just expressing there. And if you're not a prayer to God, praying is talking to God. It says that he interprets the cries of our hearts, just like a mother understands the cries of her baby. She knows if it's hungry or needs a hug. It's not the eloquence of your prayer, it's the honesty of your prayer he connects with. So begin to pray for yourself. Father, thank you for this wonderful story through the resurrection of recreation through Jesus. God, we want this. We need this in our own lives. This is what Jesus paid for. My prayer is that heaven would come and that you would grow us, that you would spark something in us, that we would see and apprehend that which Jesus has paid for. And I pray this for Jesus' glory, for the joy that Jesus endured the cross for. And God's people said, amen.